Hello, friends of the IACL blog, and welcome to another book interview. I'm Elisabeth Perham, one of the co-editors of the blog, and I am delighted to be joined by Professor Michel Rosenfeld to have a chat with him about his new book, A Pluralist Theory of Constitutional Justice, published by Oxford University Press. I have a copy of it here. Oh, not really showing up. Of course, Professor Rosenfeld will be known to many of you as Professor Emeritus of the IACL. Among other things, he's the University Professor of Law and Comparative Democracy, Justice Sidney L. Robbins Professor of Human Rights, and Director of the Program on Global and Comparative Constitutional Theory at the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law at Yeshiva University in New York. He was also the founding editor of the International Journal of Constitutional Law and has held visiting professorships in France, Spain, Italy, Hungary, Canada, Belgium, and the UK. So welcome, Professor Rosenfeld, and congratulations on the publication of your book.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I thought I'd start by asking about something that you note in the acknowledgements in the book, which is that this book's a culmination of a long process of integrating two separate strands of your own scholarship, which I'm sure many of our listeners will be familiar with. So your scholarship in constitutional theory and your scholarship in philosophy. So what I wanted to ask was whether you could tell us a little bit more about that journey of integrating those strands. And for example, what inspired you to take that up? What did it look like before you landed where you did, which is this project, which you call a pluralist theory of constitutional justice, focusing on the relationship between liberal constitutionalism and distributive justice?
Well, the first thing I should say is that viewed from the outside, those two trends may seem to be really part of the same thing, in the sense that I have worked on the relationship between philosophy and law in the sense of legal philosophy, ethics, and morals. And on the other hand, I have worked on the theoretical side of constitutionalism. And I've done this since the beginning of my career. My first published article was on free speech and the media, and I looked into the philosophical foundations of free speech. What I mean by two trends, given that background, is that I approach the questions of law's legitimacy and the relationship between law and justice from the standpoint of a philosophical literature. I was a student when what became a revolution in the United States arose, namely the publication of John Rawls's A Theory of Justice. So working on justice, which I started before, but it wasn't fashionable, became very fashionable. And I continued pursuing that. I also have a degree in law and a degree in philosophy. So I've been trained in both fields. And at the same time, when I started teaching law, I approached various problems in constitutional law and try to think about them in mainly theoretical ways, although I also dealt with doctrinal issues. But I've always believed that there is a strong connection between theory and practice, and you cannot do one without the other if you're a scholar. And so that took me, if you look at the works I've published before this book, into two different directions. There were overlaps and there were some crossovers, but I kept asking myself, having reached a point in my career where I had these two separate bodies of work, what is the connection between the two of them? And that intrigued me because I would get into the constitutional theory thing and take for granted a whole bunch of assumptions which I did not take for granted when I did the other work, which was what makes law legitimate, what makes law, what's the connection between law and justice. And so I embarked on trying to fill that gap for myself. And I actually started, this has been a very long project in the sense that I've been publishing many other things in between. So it's not as if I was paralyzed, but this particular project was a fairly long project in that I had an initial idea while I was a visitor in London on a Leverhulme chair. And the chair permitted gathering a group of scholars to discuss an idea that I would have for new scholarship. So given that luxury, my host invited a number of wonderful scholars, and I had an initial idea or a few pages to see if my idea of combining would work. And I got a lot of positive feedback. And then I had to reconceive the whole thing. This all came to a head, in a sense, thanks to the pandemic. And that is because I was fortunate that I could, I was unfortunate in many ways, as we all were, but I was fortunate that I was isolated during the pandemic in a house in the country, teaching on Zoom, plus having a sabbatical after that. So I was pretty much isolated with family, but very little professional contact except on Zoom. And I really undertook this project as my main occupation with very few distractions. And as a result of that, I struggled through this, this idea and found a solution to it for me. And the solution for me to this combining these two trends in my scholarship resulted in this book. I did not start with the idea that the question of justice is central, of distributive justice, because the particular form of justice is central to constitutional law, because it's not that much discussed. But the more I worked on trying to see the connections, it occurred to me that there was a fundamental link between the two, and that allowed me to bring my two worlds together. So that is a quick account of how this came about.
Yeah, great. And so then picking up on the last point, which is that justice, the idea of distributive justice, becomes central to the analysis in the book. I wondered if you could share again, it may be hard to do briefly, but share with our audience what the book's main claim is. So what is involved in a pluralist theory of justice, I guess, is part of that question, but also, you know, why does the pluralist theory of justice matter? Okay,
so there are several, let's say, steps to get to this. One of the, and this became more urgent and more central when I started working on this, is the current trend, which is a little over a decade old now, and at least as a subject of intense discussion, the trend in many countries towards populism and illiberalism. And one of the, I had worked on both comparative constitutional law and on transnational, on at least the questions raised by transnational and global constitutional law. And I was wondering whether the whole liberal constitutional tradition was deficient, and can it be defended or salvaged in view of these attacks, and how we seem in many ways unprepared to deal with these attacks, which have occurred in the United States and Western Europe, and not only in the countries that have authoritarian traditions. And so I started thinking about, is there a plausible connection between just distributive justice and constitutional law, or is constitutional law really something that in and of itself is neutral or irrelevant with respect to justice? Now, in a very narrow sense, there always have been questions of distributive justice within constitutions, in the sense of the question, some constitutions have them, others do not. The question of social and economic rights, that's clearly explicitly raised questions of distributive justice. But is there a broader, a broader possible understanding of constitutional, liberal constitutionalism in terms of justice? And in exploring this, I went back and then found that, yes, even if we go back to the French and American revolutions in the late 18th century, there is an implicit concern with distributive justice. Of course, their main concern was to get rid of feudal hierarchy and consider every human being equal to everyone else. So in this, if you wish, rather general sense, there is an implicit commitment to distributive justice, but I thought it went deeper. But there wasn't that much concern at that time about questions of social and economic justice. I then, from the philosophical literature, drew on authors who had expanded the traditional notion of distributive justice as relating to material welfare, and also introduced the notion that distributive justice relates to recognition. We all want to be either in our group belongings or as individuals recognized as equals and to be treated in a proportionate way. And finally, the third dimension is the question of equality in representation. So I decided to make the focus and to link this to constitutional issues between these three dimensions of distributive justice. So in part, I looked at how we got here. In part, and this is influenced by my being in the United States, where the Constitution recognizes absolutely no social and economic rights. And then that's the constitutional side, and trying to, if you wish, draw out of it what seemed to be natural distributive justice concerns and questions. And then from the other side, the main problem that I had in trying to bring the two sides together is that there's no agreement. And one of the things about distributive justice is that philosophers vehemently disagree about it. So viewing a constitution as something that in a democracy, in theory, we all agree on our own constitution. We know that in fact that's not true, but at least that there is a sufficient consensus on a constitution. How can we have sufficient consensus if we all vehemently disagree about questions of justice? In my own country, there is a very pronounced disagreement between neoliberals, who are all critics of Rawls, and what is a liberal egalitarian position such as that of Rawls. In other countries, the spectrum is different, but you do have similar disagreements. And so that led me to the idea of a minimum of justice, which I call the justice essentials. And I borrow that or create that phrase based on the theory of Rawls, who he started from philosophy, and he was not, I mean, he said a few things about constitutions and law, but I mean, he was not trained in law. And he said, in order to have a just society, it has to respect what he calls the constitutional essentials. So I figured, going from the other end of this relationship, starting with constitutions, do they have to have some justice essentials? And so my argument is that yes, that is a minimum that we need if we can continue justifying liberal constitutionalism. And then the last step in this process is turning to pluralism. Because there is no agreement, can we get people who disagree to acknowledge that they must agree on a minimum while remaining in disagreement over other questions of justice, morals, politics, and so forth. So this is really the steps that I undertook and that ended up with the book.
Excellent, thank you. And yeah, I mean, I've read the book and it's great. I think, you know, those steps you kind of go through in 3 parts in ways that even for someone, I think, like me, who's not that familiar necessarily with all the theorists and philosophers you deal with, you know, was you know, easy to follow, and I think presents a really cogent argument. And so I guess the next question, coming back to what you said at the beginning of that answer, was that you were sort of interested in these questions about whether, liberal constitutionalism is somehow deficient, or if there are ways that we can deal with the challenges to it. I wonder if you could speak a bit to kind of what you hope to see as the book's main contribution, and if you have hopes about how others will pick up the arguments and use them, or develop them, or if you don't really have particular hopes. It's just something you wanted to explore.
Well, you mentioned the three parts, and in order to give you an answer, let me refer to the three parts. The first part is really a question, it does two things. One is it discusses an ideal. What if this worked perfectly fine? And so I try to discuss what is the best hope for liberal constitutionalism? What presuppositions, what beliefs, what institutions, etc., would be agreed upon in order to justify this? And the task is made much more difficult in light of what I call the pathologies that are exploited by populist and illiberal people, which, among other things, law becomes more and more distant. It seems less and less democratic. This is seen very well in countries like the European Union or the United States. Most corporate law, for instance, is dealt through with the corporation choosing where they want to be under the rule of law, privatizing the rule of law by getting arbitrators, and they need a legal regime, but they're able to shop around it. Then there's the question of surveillance capitalism. We haven't quite figured it out, and I certainly have not figured it out because I'm not a technological expert, but these algorithms, this sort of collecting the information so that you lose your own control over what you're being solicited for and how you're being exploited and used, et cetera, and how all the information is collected about you. Then there is the other problem that I have dealt with in other scholarship, which I am now dealing with again in a book that I'm co-authoring about what I call the repoliticization of religion, the use of religion, which is very much not as a religious matter, but as a political matter in the context of populism and illiberalism. And then the discussion, which many people who have spoken about the threats that our democracies are facing today, of going with the political opposition from what is called an adversary relationship to relationship of being enemies. And so that, in fact, we're losing, and we're seeing this in the United States right now, as there's, with these indictments of Trump, an exacerbation of divisions, political divisions, and there's no dialogue and there's no common basis. Republicans are saying the entire Justice Department, state apparatus, etc., is all a conspiracy to consolidate power. Democrats think that the Republicans are lawless people that we shouldn't talk to. So there is a real deterioration. And so the question is, first of all, we have to, and this was exacerbated by other things such as the so-called war on terror and the pandemic, which also created a lot of disruption, disagreement, in many respects, dysfunction in the United States, and a country that had, relatively speaking, more deaths than any other advanced industrialized country, et cetera, et cetera. So part one is the diagnostic. Part two is revisiting the key jurisprudential and philosophical figures that I consider have a possible strong impact on these issues, and to see if, and what can I learn from all of these, and what can I not learn. And just to give one example, I deal in one chapter on the reduction, on the attempts to reduce law to either politics or economics, and try to show how, whereas law has to be connected to both, it cannot be reduced to both. And then at the end of part 2, where I've discussed all these various philosophical positions, I find that they give us many valuable insights, but on the other hand, they do not solve the problem. So my argument for pluralism is that it invites dialogue. So if anybody buys into it, and number 2, in theory, it says you don't have to give up your jurisprudential, constitutional, or philosophical position. Come to the discussion with your views, and let's see if we can agree on a minimum. And I say that is, in my view, the only hope we're going to come out of this without falling into because in many respects, what the populists and illiberals are doing is very attractive. You only talk to people that you agree with. Now, I may have views that are on the left, some people have views on the right, some people may have views on the center, but we only talk to one another. We reinforce each other in what we believe in, and we completely eliminate the rest. But you cannot have a democracy that works that way. So it's an appeal and trying to show the way by discussing all of the things that were raised in part 1 and 2 and trying to reconsider them from the standpoint of what I call a dialectic, which is a dynamic. The pluralism doesn't give you an answer, but it gives you an idea of how to proceed and how much must you give up, how much can you preserve, how do you preserve society in a peaceful way and as a common project. I do say that that's my hope, but I have absolutely I don't have any prophetic qualities. So I have no idea if 10 years from now, 20 years from now, what I am proposing might be closer to reality, or it may just be viewed as some kind of dream of someone at the end of the era of liberal constitutionalism. That I have no answer, and I do point that out in the conclusion that I may be too late with this idea. I hope not, but as I view it, that's the only way that we can, at the same time, preserve our differences, and it's all in relation to the balance of these 3 aspects of distributive justice. We've got to do a minimum so everybody has enough to lead a decent life. We must recognize each other, acknowledging that we have differences in the way we think and the way we approach various things, and we must have a representative democracy. So trying to balance all this, I say one of the, not the only one, but one of the very important and indispensable ingredients is what I call the justice essentials, which amounts to a minimum of justice through the Constitution.
Right. Well, I guess we can only wait and see, but we can hope that in 10 or 20 years' time, things do look a little bit closer to that. So one question we often ask in these interviews is just if you could reflect on the main challenges that you faced in writing the book, because I think, writing a book is a big undertaking, as you've sort of already spoken about. And I think it can be useful for our audience to hear about what, if there are challenges that you faced.
Well, the biggest challenge that I had, there were 2. One, I would say, was a theoretical challenge, and it took me years to get to this. And that is that I was really very much persuaded that I had to find this internal link between my 2 bodies of work, because somehow both of them were incomplete, and there was something missing to try to find a connection. And that was very hard, and it took many detours, and there were false starts, and it's about thinking about figuring out, and then even when I started writing, I didn't know where I would end. So in this sense, this project, I've had other projects like the project that I'm doing now, because I've previously written on it, and I have a theory. I pretty much know what it's going to, I'm co-authoring it, and I have co-authored with my co-author an article on what is turning into a book. So we pretty much know what to expect, where we're going. We have a theory, and there's a joy in writing it down, making it concrete, etc. But there's much less anxiety, I think, than in this project. So that was the theoretical issue, and it really all cohered together once I started writing it. And the last thing I wrote was the introduction. So I didn't know exactly where I would go, but then I knew that there would be the parts, and then I developed them, and then finally once I had basically finished the thought process that was expressed in the book, then I could write the introduction and complete the whole thing. From a more, let's say, human everyday point of view, this book was anxiety provoking in a very different way because of the pandemic. When I write, I have colleagues that I could just bounce off an idea, just walk into somebody's office and say, look, I just thought about this idea. You think it's crazy, or do you have any comments? Or I can give them a chapter or first draft, etc. I found that very difficult during the pandemic because we were so isolated and people had so many different circumstances, so that I was writing all this with no feedback. And that is a very unsettling thing. I am reassured to a sufficient extent, obviously one never knows for sure. I've been lucky to have had a couple of conferences on my book already, panels on my book. And I can see from the comments of the scholars, even those who have disagreed with my views, that they've taken them pretty seriously and that I can defend myself. So even though I lack this kind of exchange, which is very important for a scholar because of the unique circumstances of the pandemic, at the other end of that, I don't think the book has suffered too much because of that.
Yeah, and I guess it's also the nice thing that there is the opportunity for engagement now as well. And so the final question I wanted to ask, and you've alluded to some of this already, but if you could just speak a little bit to what you're working on now and, you know, what's kind of coming next. So you've spoken a bit about the project on religion, so maybe.
Right. I am co-authoring with Susanna Mancini, who is a professor at the University of Bologna and a vice president of the International Association of Constitutional Law, a book called Politicized Religion and the Reframing of Fundamental Rights, which will be published by Oxford University Press, and which tackles the redefinition of rights by populists and what I would call first the reference to or appropriation of religion for political purposes, and to use it to reframe certain fundamental rights. And so that is we've had in the United States, there's been an increase in religious rights. Usually these increases are associated with nationalism, with exclusion, with discrimination against women, discrimination against LGBTQ people, et cetera, et cetera. So we are trying to give a systematic accounting, again, of both the virtues and the flaws of secularism as an institution in constitutional democracies, and then on the appropriation and the challenges posed by these redefinitions of rights. That's one project. The other project, which I'm doing, which is more of an editor's than an author, although I'll have my own short chapter in it, I am collaborating with a colleague who teaches in the UK, Marinos Diamantidis, who on a handbook on the law and politics of sovereignty. Sovereignty also is a concept that has become very disputed. We have about 30 or 32 chapters, and we are now in the process of starting to collect them. So we will put this together, and hopefully in not too long, it'll be another one of these. It's the Elgar Publishing Company handbooks, research handbooks. So I'm quite busy doing that, but I'm very devoted to scholarship. So I enjoy that part of my job a lot.
Excellent. Well, they both sound like fascinating projects. So we look forward to the outcomes of those. So thank you so much, Professor Rosenfeld, for joining us. And thanks also to our listeners and viewers for joining us today. If you're listening and you enjoyed the discussion and you're interested in getting a hold of the book, you can head over to our new titles and discounts section on the website for some information. And for more of the same, you can obviously keep up to date with the IACL blog by following us on Twitter or subscribing to our mailing list. And finally, if you've recently published a book on constitutional law and you're interested in being featured in a book interview, you can get in touch with us at iacl.blogeditor@gmail.com. Thank you.